Have you been in a career that provides steady income, a good lifestyle, but no longer gives you the satisfaction and joy that you may have once had? Are you willing to take the risk of leaving a secure position, reinventing yourself on a new life path? Today's speaker took the plunge, left behind a lucrative medical career, and has never looked back. Welcome to the Men in Love series. I'm your host, Dr. Erica Goodstone. In this event, you will hear from thought leaders on the forefront of knowledge and experience about men and life and love. So today, I'm delighted to welcome George Huang MD. Thank you for coming.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
So please tell us about your background, your education, your training and experience that first led you into your medical career and then led you out of it into a whole new thing.
Well, actually, it goes back probably to third grade. I remember writing in my school book, when they say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I think in first grade, I probably wrote like forest ranger, and then second grade was like fireman, and then third grade, I checked the other box and I wrote surgeon. And I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I was watching Marcus Welby, MD or something. But it wasn't until I was 17 that I really decided to become a plastic surgeon. I was visiting my brother who was training in neurology at the Mayo Clinic, and I was waiting for him to complete rounds, and I saw this. I was in the medical library. I saw this giant oversized book, and I kind of found me. I just had to open it up because I'd never seen a book of that size. And it was plastic surgery before and after. It wasn't the pretty glamorous cosmetic surgery. It was massive injury and trauma and reconstruction. And in that instant, I said to myself, I'm doing, this is what I'm doing. Because it was creative. I was self-teaching myself photography. I knew I wanted to be a doctor, and that's the most creative field artistically in medicine. And so that was age 17. I didn't know it was going to take 15 years from that point to become a plastic surgeon.
Well,
if you count. Oh yeah, 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 5 years of general surgery residency, and 2 years of plastic surgery residency. And all of a sudden, I'm 32 years old, newly minted plastic surgeon.
So I have a question right in there. How did that affect your relationships? Just working so hard.
Oh, well, sometimes, a lot of times I was on call every other night. And when we were on call, we were up continuously. Sometimes I was up 36, even 48 hours in a row. And how does it affect relationships? Well, I was crabby a lot of the times. I mean, let's face it, human beings are not designed to be that chronically sleep deprived. And I think it's hard to be at one's best, including in relationships, and especially intimate relationships, when we're not feeling well, when we're just wishing we could get more sleep and get some rest and relaxation, which is really hard to do during that training period.
So, and then what led you to leave the medical field and go out on your own?
Well, once I got started, I started out in Seattle in 1995, and super excited to get started. But, within 2 years of being in practice, I was nearly broke. I didn't know how to run a practice. I just was following naively what the older plastic surgeons said. They said, well, just do good work and the rest will take care of itself. Well, that's probably the worst piece of advice you could give somebody starting out. Like, probably the worst. Because that's not true. It's just, maybe when they started out in the 1960s, okay, maybe that was the case.
Right, maybe word of mouth brought them people easily.
Well, it was a different time period, different time, different era, different economy. So they got established in the 60s and 70s, and it was just a different way of building a practice back then. So quickly got into trouble. My accountant suggested I declare bankruptcy after 2 years, and I thought, that's just incredible. I can't believe this nightmare is happening to my dream career. Mm-hmm. So I didn't declare bankruptcy. I figured, well, I'll study. If I can become a plastic surgeon, I can learn the business side of medicine. So I started learning about marketing and selling and business financial management and hiring and firing and all that stuff. I turned the practice around, and my practice was bought by a medical center, and I practiced another 4.5 years after that. But what really bothered me a lot is that I was doing more and more cosmetic surgery because it paid so much better, and I didn't have to wrestle with insurance companies for reimbursement. But the more cosmetic surgery I did, the less happy I was. And my wife knew it. She told me at one point, probably about 2 or 3 years before I left, she said, if you keep going like this, you're going to die an early death. Mm-hmm. And I think I vaguely recall snarling at her and telling her, yeah, you're right. I got to get out of this lousy career. But, I didn't know what I was going to do. What was it? I was highly trained to do this.
Not only highly trained, but highly respected. And, you get a certain energy from that.
Yeah, but, I didn't really care about that. I didn't really care. And I knew in my head and heart that, it doesn't really matter what you're doing in life in terms of a career or a profession or a vocation. As long as it's aligned with your values and you're trying to do something good to help people. But when I left, so one of the triggers for leaving was when our second son was born in 2003. And at that point, I was just so miserable. I left at that point. I didn't have an escape plan. It wasn't all planned out. It was just like, I'm done, just done. And what I realized is that I went through an identity crisis during that time. For a couple of years, I didn't do anything. One time I was sitting at the dining room table and my wife said, well, what are you doing there? Because I was just sitting there going, ah. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know who I am anymore. And I thought, like, intellectually, I knew intellectually I could do anything. But I'd spent my whole early adult life being a surgeon, or training to be a surgeon and being a surgeon. And that's who I knew myself to be.
And I have a question in there. What was that like for your wife? I mean, she's married to a surgeon, successful surgeon, and life is good. And all of a sudden you're sitting there, not doing it. That happens a lot to people.
It does. And, through all this stuff, she was very, very supportive. And one of the things she said was, well, you have to do something that you enjoy doing. And she knew I was just miserable, right? I didn't like it. And I wanted to be, I didn't want to be one of those dads who was away at work all the time and never saw their kids grow up or be in these school events and play sports. So I wanted to be around. So her mindset was, okay, fine. If you don't want to do this, find something else that you really enjoy doing. Now, was it easy for her? Probably not. I mean, you should talk to her sometime. Right? And it wasn't.
And she at least gave you the support, which is invaluable.
Yeah. She wasn't one of these people who said, you have to go back and do, what you're doing. And, at the time, being an entrepreneur is not easy. There are roller coasters in terms of how things work. There are roller coasters in terms of cash flow. And, at one point, this is like in those first couple of years after I left plastic surgery, she said, well, what's your backup plan? Because I was not making any money, right? And everything I tried, which was entrepreneur, didn't work for the first couple of years.
But that's something they don't tell you about these businesses, that it doesn't always work.
No, just buy my program and my step-by-step blueprint, and in 90 days, just follow what I did and you'll be golden. It drives me nuts.
Me too, because it doesn't work like that.
No. Well, for it to work, you have to think like that person. You have to have their mindset. You have to be able to make decisions and take action like them. And you can't do it like a blueprint. Same thing with relationships. You can't blueprint it out.
Right. You really have to be yourself and follow what interests you in your style.
Yeah.
And then find a way. So how did you find a way? What did you do?
Well, I had trained a lot extensively outside of medicine. I knew I needed to find ways to develop the skills of listening, because in the medical model in general, we're not really taught how to listen to patients.
And you shared something when I spoke to you about a patient who wanted you to be their primary doctor and you were upset by it? Tell us about that.
Well, it happened more than once, actually. And I don't remember the first time it happened, but the second time it happened, I remember quite vividly. It was a male patient, and I don't even remember why he came in, but after we were done with the reason he came in to see me, he said, "Hey, doc, by the way, do you think you could be my primary care doctor?" And I was still a bit stunned because I was still, from an ego perspective, I was still slightly offended, even though I had been trying to work on my ego. And I had the presence of mind, however, to ask him. I said, "Well, how come?" And he said, "Well, because you listen." And I was stunned further in a different way, and I thought about it, and probably had a puzzled look on my face, and I said, "Well, wait a second, how come don't all doctors listen?" And he goes, "No, they don't." And I'm like, "Are you sure?" I didn't say that, but I'm thinking
a lot of us can relate to that.
But I mean, I'm kind of naive in certain ways and idealistic. And what I told him, I said, "I can't be your primary care physician because I'm so super specialized. I don't even remember antihypertensive drugs anymore," right? But the point being that, I did train a lot outside of medicine to learn to relate to people and to be able to listen in the spoken and the unspoken.
Wow. So how did that translate into building a business as an entrepreneur?
Well, I think that going through the training that I did and really, and I wouldn't take it back if I had to do it all over again. I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I wouldn't take it back. I've had the privilege, and it's truly a privilege, of interacting with and taking care of people from all walks of life, from the destitute and homeless to the ultra rich and wealthy and everybody else in between. At the full spectrum of health and disease, from people who are perfectly healthy, like a lot of the cosmetic patients I worked on, and to the people who are near death, or even talking to family members of patients who've died. And that's given me really a perspective on life and on what it is to be human that you could never buy. And I'm sure you could get it in other ways other than going through the training that I did. But that happened to be my journey and my path. And it's given me, I think, a richer experience of being alive. And it certainly helped me in being an entrepreneur and really taking a leap of faith. And it's helped me in terms of being a parent as well. And of course, it's being a spouse. I mean, I'm still working on all those parts. It doesn't end.
But that's the part that people don't realize in the business and with your family and your children. It's an ongoing learning.
Absolutely. And if to do this, to be successful in business, it's absolutely critical to grow oneself from the inside out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very valuable insight. So getting back to being a plastic surgeon, you also shared about something, because I had asked you, did you work mostly with women? Because most of us think that we think of plastic surgery and think of women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
you said no, that you've also worked with men. So tell us about what it was like working with the men.
Yeah, well, men have body image issues as well. And men have concerns about their appearances and how they look in the mirror and how they look to other people. And so, but I think that, and I was thinking about this morning before we started speaking, I think from a Western societal perspective, it's more socially acceptable to talk about these things as they relate to women. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I was like, I've said this to my wife before. It's like, if you look at like clothing, women have all these different different colors, different styles. Men, it's kind of boring for men.
Well, I noticed at the Australian Tennis Open, that two of the leading players were wearing pink sneakers. With pink sneakers. I couldn't get over it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think in the sports arena, it's more accepted to be a little bit outside the box. right? And the pink ties in with the, what's that, bow for the breast cancer,
the breast
right?
cancer, right.
Yeah,
Maybe,
yeah.
maybe that was the reason. I don't know.
Exactly,
But
yeah.
it struck me.
Right. Yeah. So it's not as common, I think, to talk about these things in the open for men, right?
So what kind of surgeries have men had that you've dealt with?
Oh, almost the same ones as women. I remember doing a tummy tuck on a male, and then he came back to see me the following week. And he goes, "I hope it was okay. The next day after my surgery, I went and tried out for the men's choir." I'm like, "Ooh, I wouldn't have recommended," but he made it. He was selected. So yeah, I mean, rhinoplasty, so nose facelifts. I've done those. Pretty much anything, eyelids, brows.
But I've also had clients that had chest work and other areas.
Yeah, I never did that. Yeah, the people who had calf implants and chest pectoralis implants, and buttock implants. I never did those, but it is done. And yeah.
And then you also talked about men needing reconstruction from some kind of injury.
Sure, and that's really what I enjoy doing and women needed that as well. But I saw a lot more men because fishermen would be flown in from Alaska off of a fishing boat, and then they would see me for some sort of hand or upper extremity injury, maybe a facial.
What was it like for them emotionally to have the trauma and go through the surgery?
Most of these guys, these were tough cookies, and from the exterior, that's you bring up a whole nother ball of wax. We could have another totally separate conversation about how allopathic deals with the whole person, or actually doesn't deal with the whole person. But for my level of awareness at that time, I didn't really deal with the emotional side of things. And any type of in retrospect, I know that some men and some women went through a lot of emotional trauma that I never saw. Because I'm the surgeon, I take care of the injury acutely, and it's all healed up, you're done.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much more to being injured than just the physical, get the thing healed.
Right, the vulnerability for a man that hasn't been vulnerable.
Oh, there's the identity. You go through an identity crisis. If I can't use my hand, or if I have this scar on my face, who am I? And there's also the trauma itself. Right? And some people can end up with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Sure.
There's also the, it's in this society, a lot of men, including myself, grew up thinking we have to be strong. Can't show our emotion, we can't cry. But it's just part of being human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so another thing that I talked a little bit about with you is that many men feel like they don't fit into their ethnic group or their family or their social group or their religious group.
Yeah.
So talk about that, because I know personally you had a sense that you didn't quite fit in.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, I was born here in the States, but early in my life I lived in the Deep South in the 60s when there was a lot of racial tension going on. We lived actually an hour away from Memphis. And so we were living there when Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Really?
And, as a kid at that age, I don't recall experiencing any type of significant racial discord, but I know that my brother and sisters who were older than me experienced it. They don't talk much about it, but I know they did. I think that what it did for me is I'm kind of colorblind when it comes to skin, right? Because let me put it this way. Growing up, I felt in many ways out of place because I'm not 6 foot tall and blonde haired and blue eyed.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that, that's what you're supposed to be, but that's not true. It's not everybody is that way. But I grew up in a mostly white society, right? And I wanted to fit in, like most people want to fit in some shape or form, right? So it was hard for me because I just looked different. And I didn't feel like I fit in because I don't really understand Asian culture. I don't speak an Asian language. People come up and, do you speak Chinese or Japanese? I'm like, no, but I had 4 years of high school German. That throws them off.
Well, you've also come from a very educated background. Tell about what your brothers and your father did for a living.
Oh, well, my brother's a doctor. My dad was an MD with 2 PhDs. One of my uncles was a doctor, and one of my grandfathers was a doctor.
So you came from this educated family, and that's what you knew.
That's all I knew, right? Yeah. So growing up, I think it was really hard for me because I didn't really have anybody to talk to about these things. When I went through adolescence, and I saw people, hanging out with each other, the cheerleaders hanging out with the football players, and I'm not designed to be a football player, so that was out, right? I'm just trying to, and so I just had a very warped sense of my relationship to relationships with women and with myself, because where do we talk about these things? We don't.
And so how did that change? What helped you to get a better understanding?
Well, what changed is I ended up getting involved with a lot of very emotionally needy women. And my pattern was highly attractive, like physically attractive women, highly emotionally needy on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know that I had this pattern until one day when I was in medical school, my brother told me that I had this pattern. I said, no, I don't. I don't have this. They're all stable. And in retrospect, they're like, no, they weren't. Now, thank goodness my wife is stable, but it was a big journey, massive learning experience, and a lot of heartache involved.
So what advice would you give to men about love, relationships,
Yeah.
finding what's really good for them?
Yeah, a lot, but I would say to have the courage to look deep inside, not look outside for answers, but look deep inside for what your values are, what's important to you in the world, and how do you want to lead your life. And surround yourself with people, not just women, but men, other people who align with those values. They may not be identical, but they align with those values. And lead your life in alignment, in accordance with those values. And be willing to be vulnerable. In other words, be willing to not know who you are. Be willing to expand. It is hard. I mean, because we have our egos, right? But do the work ongoingly. It's an ongoing process to put your ego in its appropriate place. And what I've seen in my whole career is a surgeon and even in entrepreneurship is that our egos are what mostly get in our way and cause massive, massive problems, not just intellectually, because sometimes we make bad decisions based on our egos, but also emotionally. And if the more we can do to put our egos in its place, which is a small part of who we are, the more freedom that one will experience. The less victimhood we'll experience.
So what do you mean by putting the ego in a place?
Oh, well, our ego is really protective. But if we're threatened, like if someone says, well, you can't do that, well, I'll show you I can do it. Well, you're putting out that kind of energy, and that kind of energy is not as, for most people, not as fluid or freeing. Creates a lot of internal tension. It raises a lot of stress hormones in the body, which then in turn break down the immune system, which then in turn lead to a lot of disease, some of which you don't want to have, right? And then it also creates this low and high levels of stress that make it so that you're not really fun to be around. You know what? You're just not fun people to work with, right?
So I have one more question that I think you could help a lot of men with. If they're in some kind of job and they want to be an entrepreneur, want to get out there and do something different, what would you recommend? Where to begin or how to begin?
Yeah. Well, the place to start start writing down some notes, start doodling and drawing out little things to start expressing yourself. And then pick one idea. It doesn't have to be the ultimate idea. It doesn't have to be completely thought through, but pick one idea and just start testing it. And how do you test it? You start asking people about it. Create a little mock-up. Don't create the whole thing. Create a little mock-up. Create some ideas. Create a framework for it that could be some pictures or drawings or a little something that just works partially. And go start talking to people about it. See how they respond. And in that way, if they don't like it, then go try a different idea, take a different direction. But my point is to start expressing oneself rather than trying to think about it intellectually and wait until you get something perfect. Go and do it. Take a small step.
One of the things about the trainings is that I know several people that just take so many trainings.
Oh,
Every week they're signing up for another training rather than sitting down and doing it and maybe not succeeding perfectly, but you learn.
Yeah.
Share about that for a moment.
Well, I'm all for learning, ongoing learning, right? But I have this saying that information is interesting, but implementation means everything. And what I'm talking about is taking action. And I think that, so I'd rather know less and take more action, right? What I've seen is that a lot of people learn and learn and learn. They spend tens of thousands of dollars on all these different training programs, and they don't implement. And they may dabble a little bit, but they certainly don't follow through to the point where they're seeing results that either work or don't work and can make the appropriate course corrections. Mm-hmm. And so I think that a lot of people have this mistaken idea that if they just take one more course, it's going to be the magic elixir that all of a sudden everything starts working, all right? And that's unlikely. It's highly unlikely. And I think a lot of people use it as a way to avoid doing the hard work, doing the hard things that they don't want to do, including looking at themselves.
It's not including, that's like the main thing to do that they're avoiding.
Exactly.
And I was going to say that what you're talking about, doing that hard work rather than finding some quick answers, like people will go for therapy for a relationship, marital therapy, but they're not really willing to do whatever the work is, to look at themselves and really do it. They just want this person to help them and fix the problem, and usually to fix the other person.
Exactly. Yeah. And that doesn't, clearly, that doesn't work. Yeah.
So if you have any last advice to share.
Yeah, I do. From a surgeon's perspective, and I said to you before, I'm colorblind when it comes to people. I like people to keep this visual in mind as whoever's listening or watching goes through their everyday lives. So as a surgeon, once I made the incision through one's skin, whatever color, start moving skin back and seeing what's underneath, magically everybody was the same.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing? The blood was still red. The muscle was still, the bones are still bones. So what I'm saying is that we're all really the same underneath. Why do we have to have all this discord about how people look, what color they are, all these things that we use to isolate people? I don't fully call me naive, but I'm talking about it from a surgeon's perspective. Everybody's the same. We're built the same way, right? So I encourage people to think about this in terms of how you relate to each other and one another, and use this as a way to tame one's ego in terms of saying, well, I'm better than you because of blah, blah, blah. Well, you may be a better tennis player than me, but I may be better at running a marketing campaign than you. Okay. but doesn't make me a better human being.
Right.
Right.
Either one.
So how about if we honor each other, honor ourselves, and learn
from each other,
and learn from each other. And I don't mean that from a Pollyannish kind of perspective. I mean this from a very practical perspective, one that I think makes a lot of logical sense and one that makes a lot of heart sense.
That's beautiful. So how can people get in touch with you? Maybe if they want to take some training with you, just tell us what you offer.
Oh, okay. Well, if you're somebody who has an entrepreneurial mindset, that's who I work with, entrepreneurs. I have a lot of resources available. Probably the best place to start is go to my website, which is freedompreneur.com. It's freedom followed by PRENEUR.com. And when you get to the homepage, you'll be able to sign up to get a bundle of ebooks that I've written. Mostly about, about rapid revenue acceleration, the pathway to that. But also there's an ebook that even if you're not an entrepreneur, I just realized it would be useful. And it's about, it's a technique called broadcasting, and it's intended, what it does is helps you to attract the things in life that are important to you. And by the way, I didn't mention this to you earlier. It's a technique I was taught by one of my teachers. He passed away when he was 100.
Wow.
He was a World War II fighter pilot ace, turned yoga master. And when I first met him when he was 88, he taught me this technique to help me find my wife. And that's how I found her.
Oh, that sounds beautiful.
Yeah, my teacher, Dr. G, his real name is Michael Gladish. He goes by Dr. G. It's easier to pronounce. And after I mentioned he was a World War II fighter pilot ace, and his teacher, yoga teacher, found him during the war. He showed up at the barracks one day and said, "I'm here to teach you." Like, where'd you come from, right? And he said to him, "I'm going to teach you Raja Yoga principles at night, and by day you're going to fly and fight for, the war. And when you're going to survive the war, and when the war is over, you're going to take what I taught you and teach it to other people and help them."
Okay.
Right. So long story short, I have a lot of Dr. G stories, but long story short, Dr. G got his PhD in psychology, came to the States, and he had a friend who knew Albert Einstein, who was a professor at the time at Princeton University. So he asked his friend to arrange a lunch meeting with him, with Dr. Einstein. And so they're walking around the Princeton campus, and Dr. G asks Dr. Einstein a question. He says, physics and philosophy look at life from two different perspectives. Physics looks at it from the perspective of the physicality, like how do things work. And psychology looks at life from the perspective of love. And he kind of asked for confirmation from Dr. Einstein if he agreed on this concept. And he said, "Yeah, that makes sense." Okay, and then so Dr. G says to Dr. Einstein, if psychology looks at life from the perspective of love, what's the physical correlate of love? What's the counterpart, right? And they were silent. They kept walking. You can imagine Dr. Einstein with the scraggly hair scratching his head as they're walking. And then he goes, "Aha, I've got it. The physical correlate of love is radiation, energy radiating, goes everywhere at once, stopped by nothing." I asked Dr. G about that years later after he told me that story, and I said, "Did you think you had Einstein stumped?" And he smiled at me and said, "Yep."
And I read a letter that Dr. Einstein wrote to his daughter, and he changed his formula from E equals MC squared to, I forget the exact formula, but about love. And his conclusion was that there's nothing more powerful in the universe than love.
Wow.
Because, it's the exponential quality. I could send that to you. It was an amazing
I'd love to see
quote
that.
That
Yeah.
it goes, it's, limitless.
Right. I would very much like to see that.
Just repeat the website again, even though it's going to be on the page.
Right. So it's www.freedompreneur.com.
Thank you so much for participating in this series.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And for those of you listening, I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
my teacher, Dr. G, his real name is Michael Gladish. He goes by Dr. G. It's easier to pronounce. And after I mentioned he was a World War II fighter pilot ace, and his teacher, yoga teacher, found him during the war. He showed up at the barracks one day and said, "I'm here to teach you." Like, where'd you come from, right? And he said to him, "I'm going to teach you Raja Yoga principles at night, and by day you're going to fly and fight for, the war. And when you're going to survive the war, and when the war is over, you're going to take what I taught you and teach it to other people and help them." All right. So long story short, I have a lot of Dr. G stories, but long story short, Dr. G got his PhD in psychology, came to the States, and he had a friend who knew Albert Einstein, who was a professor at the time at Princeton University. So he asked his friend to arrange a lunch meeting with him, with Dr. Einstein. And so they're walking around the Princeton campus, and Dr. G asks Dr. Einstein a question. He says, physics and philosophy look at life from two different perspectives. Physics looks at it from the perspective of the physicality, like how do things work. And psychology looks at life from the perspective of love. And he kind of asked for confirmation from Dr. Einstein if he agreed on this concept. And he said, "Yeah, that makes sense." Okay, and then so Dr. G says to Dr. Einstein, if psychology looks at life from the perspective of love, what's the physical correlate of love? What's the counterpart, right? And they were silent. They kept walking. You can imagine Dr. Einstein with the scraggly hair scratching his head as they're walking. And then he goes, "Aha, I've got it. The physical correlate of love is radiation, energy radiating. Goes everywhere at once, stopped by nothing." I asked Dr. G about that years later after you told me that story, and I said, "Did you think you had Einstein stumped?" And he smiled at me and said, "Yep."
And I read a letter that Dr. Einstein wrote to his daughter, and he changed his formula from E equals MC squared to, I forget the exact formula, but about love. And his conclusion was that there's nothing more powerful in the universe than love.
Wow.
Because, it's the exponential quality. I could send that to you. It was an amazing
I'd love to see that. Yeah.
That it goes, it's, limitless.
Right. I would very much like to see that. Yeah. Cool.
So thank you so much for participating in this series.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And for those of you listening, I look forward to speaking to you again soon.